Hey guys, tonight we begin with the dark and sweltering reality of working inside an ancient Egyptian temple, where the gods demanded everything, and your personal comfort was not part of the arrangement. Then we turn to Hatshepsut, the pharaoh who should not have existed according to every rule Egypt had ever written, and yet somehow became one of the most successful rulers in 3,000 years of history. After that, we spend a day in the life of a royal tomb worker in the village of Deir el-Medina, the people who carved the Valley of the Kings, and quietly knew more state secrets than almost anyone alive. And finally, we pull back the linen curtain on what the Egyptian priesthood actually was behind its sacred walls, which turns out to be considerably more political, considerably more corrupt, and considerably more human than anyone was officially allowed to admit. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is. I always like seeing where in the world people are watching from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive before the sun does. That is the first thing nobody told you. You were given the general outline of the role, the duties, the sacred nature of the work, the honour of proximity to the divine. What you are not told is that the divine apparently begins its day extremely early and expects everyone else to do the same. The air outside is still cool in the way Egyptian air is only ever cool in those brief forgiving hours before the world remembers where it is and what it is capable of. You walk across stone that has not yet had time to accumulate a full day's worth of heat, and your feet register this as a small and temporary mercy. The sky above you is a shade between black and deep blue, and the stars that are visible in Egypt's desert air, which is most of them, are still present in that particular quality of visibility that the pre-dawn hours provide before the light begins to dilute them. The river, somewhere beyond the temple complex, is audible as a presence rather than a sound, a low continuity of water moving that sits beneath everything else in the way that important things often do. You are carrying a vessel of water, a ritual tool you have been instructed to handle with more care than you would give your own limbs, and you're already aware that you're going to be told you're doing it wrong. This is your third day. You've been told you're doing it wrong every single day so far, and the consistency of this feedback suggests it is less a response to your specific errors and more a feature of the learning environment, a pedagogical philosophy that assumes incompetence as its baseline and works upward from there. You have not yet reached the upward portion. The temple is enormous in a way that pictures never quite prepare you for. You have seen large buildings before. You have seen structures that impressed you, but the temple is not trying to impress you. It is trying to make you irrelevant. The pylons rise above you with the serene confidence of something that has been standing for a very long time and expects to continue standing long after you're no longer a concern. The gateway between the pylons is so tall that the scale of it takes a moment to fully register, and when it does, what you feel is not awe exactly, but something close to the sensation of stepping into a different system of measurement, one in which your height and your concerns are simply not the relevant unit. The walls are covered in images. This sounds simple and is not. Egyptian temple walls are not decorated in the way that the word decorated suggests, a surface embellishment added to something that exists independently. The images are the walls, in a functional sense, because every image is performing a theological task. Every hieroglyph is stating something. Every figure in every relief is occupying its precise place in a visual argument about the nature of reality and the relationship between the gods and the world they inhabit. The pharaoh is depicted in the postures of triumph, raising the mace, seizing the enemy by the hair, presenting offerings on behalf of all humanity to gods who receive them with a formal serenity that suggests they were expecting this and are satisfied by its correctness. The gods appear in their various and composite forms: the hawk-headed solar deity, the jackal-headed lord of the dead, the ibis-headed scribe of divine knowledge, the goddess whose arms are wings and whose eyes see the full extent of the sky. Every detail of their regalia, every specific attribute held in their hands, every precisely rendered element of their headdresses is a specific statement in a visual language that required years of priestly education to fully read. You do not yet read it. You are aware that you are being addressed by a text you cannot yet understand, and that the text has been saying the same things for longer than your family's memory extends in any direction. You step inside and the temperature shifts. Not dramatically, not immediately, but within a few paces you feel it. The stone keeps its cool longer than the air does, and the thick walls trap that cool with something close to intention. For a moment you think this might be the one genuine comfort the temple has to offer. Then you walk deeper in, past the outer forecourt, where the air is still open to the sky, and the quality of the space is still something you can breathe normally in, and into the hyperstyle hall, where the columns rise above you like a forest of stone that has been growing for centuries and has no intention of stopping. The columns are massive. You could not wrap your arms around one. They are wider at the top than you expected, swelling toward their capitals with a solidity that makes the ceiling above them feel like something resting rather than something suspended. Every surface, every square centimetre of every column, every section of every wall, every face of every ceiling block above you is covered in relief carving and hieroglyphic text, painted in colours that have faded over the years from their original brilliance, but that still carry enough pigment to give the hall a quality that is distinct from natural stone. Red and gold and blue and green and black, all slightly diminished by time, all still present, all still saying their various things to a reader with the training to hear them. Shafts of light fall from clerestory openings high above, cutting through the dimness in thick, deliberate columns, landing on the floor in precise rectangles that seem less like natural light, and more like light that has been assigned a task and is performing it. You're not supposed to stop and look. Stopping and looking is for people who do not have duties. You have duties. You're reminded of this by the presence of a senior Wab priest approximately 3 meters behind you, who has not spoken, but whose footsteps communicate a direction and a pace that you are expected to match. The first duty of the morning is purification, and you need to understand something about purification in this context. It is not a brief process. It is not a quick wash and a fresh change of clothes and a general intention to behave well. Purification in an Egyptian temple is an elaborate sequential non-negotiable series of steps that govern every aspect of your physical state before you are permitted to approach anything sacred, and the elaboration of the sequence is not incidental to the process but central to it. The act of preparing yourself is itself the first ritual act of the day, and it is performed with the same attention and precision that the later rituals will require. You must wash. Not simply rinse your hands, but wash yourself properly at the sacred lake, the large rectangular basin set within the temple complex whose still surface in this early hour reflects the fading stars and the first suggestions of lightening in the eastern sky. The water of the sacred lake is itself a sacred object, maintained at the temple's expense, used exclusively for ritual purposes, and its temperature at this hour is the temperature of water that has had all night to absorb the desert air. You wash your hands, your face, your feet, and the experience is bracing in the way that pre-dawn cold water is always bracing, which is to say, it is effective at creating the impression of alertness whether or not the alertness is genuinely present. Your mouth must be rinsed with a solution of natron, which is a kind of mineral salt that occurs naturally in certain desert lake deposits in Egypt, and which the Egyptians used for an enormous range of purposes, from the preservation of mummified bodies to the cleansing of ritual objects to, apparently this, the aggressive improvement of personal oral hygiene before sacred service. It has a taste that sits somewhere between unpleasant and aggressively memorable. The word for what it tastes like would require a specific vocabulary of unpleasantness that does not fully exist, but it is the kind of taste that ensures you are completely awake within seconds of experiencing it, which may be part of the theological thinking. Your clothing must be correct. White linen, freshly washed, because linen is produced from flax, which is a plant, and plants do not carry the categories of contamination associated with animal products. You're not permitted to wear wool or leather inside the inner sanctums. Wool comes from an animal's living body in an ongoing and intimate process. Leather comes from a dead animal's skin. Both categories of origin carry contamination into sacred space in ways the theological system has worked out carefully, and the new initiate has to simply memorize and observe without necessarily understanding the full reasoning behind each prohibition. There will be time for understanding later. Now there is only the linen and the cold water and the natron and the slowly growing light. You are expected to have observed dietary restrictions in the hours before service. Fish is prohibited for certain categories of priests approaching certain categories of sacred space, because fish are creatures of the chaotic waters of the primal flood, and carry a kind of uncanny contamination that has to do with their origins in a realm that predates cosmic order. Certain birds, certain meats. The exact list vary by temple and by deity, because the Egyptian theological system is not a simple unified code, but a rich and sometimes contradictory accumulation of regional traditions and historical developments and institutional preferences that has been layering itself for over 2,000 years. The temple you're in has its own specific requirements, and these requirements are documented somewhere that you have not yet been given full access to. And until you have that access, you are expected to learn them by not making mistakes, which is a pedagogical approach that also seems like a description of a minefield. You submit to all of it because you have no alternative, because refusal is not a category that exists in this system. The temple does not offer you the option of a shorter version of the purification process. It offers you the full version, every time, for every approach to any sacred space, without exception. The logic behind this is theological and absolute. The gods are pure, their space is pure. You are a human being who exists in the world, which means you arrive carrying the accumulated contamination of ordinary existence, the material residue of the physical world that the sacred space must be protected from. Removing that contamination before crossing certain thresholds is not a preference or a custom. It is a necessity, in the same way that oxygen is a necessity. Without it, the sacred space ceases to function as what it is. What they do not tell you initially is how long this process will take you every single morning. On your first day, the purification sequence consumed most of an hour, and you arrived at your duties late, which was noted by a senior Wab priest with an expression that communicated, without any words whatsoever, that being late due to inadequate purification management was simultaneously your fault, a professional failure, and a theological problem. You went faster on the second day and were told your natron rinse had been insufficient. You went slower on the third day, and the senior Wab priest communicated, again without words, that this pace was also somehow incorrect. You're beginning to develop a working theory that the correct pace is whatever pace allows them to find something to correct in you, which may be uncharitable, but which feels, by day 3, like a hypothesis with reasonable supporting evidence. Your role, technically, is that of a Wab priest, which means Pure One, a title that you're finding quietly ironic in the way that job titles which emphasize their intended qualities sometimes reflect a degree of aspiration rather than accomplished fact. The Wab are the functional base of the priestly hierarchy, the people who do the physical work of the temple, while the higher ranks concern themselves with more elevated responsibilities. You clean the ritual floors and surfaces. You carry offerings from the outer areas to the intermediate chambers. You transport things from the storage magazines to the halls, where they will be used in ways you're not yet fully informed about. You light oil lamps in the corridors and maintain their fuel levels throughout the day, moving between them on a rotation that keeps every lamp at its prescribed brightness, because the quality of the light in a temple is not incidental to the ritual environment but part of it. You sweep floors with specific brooms that must not touch specific surfaces, a distinction that sounds finicky from the outside and is, from the inside, simply part of a system of distinctions that governs everything. You carry natron, and you carry incense, and you carry water, and you carry things that are placed in your hands without explanation, and taken from them without explanation by priests of the next rank up, who are moving through their own sequence of duties in ways that occasionally intersect with yours, but that do not seem to require them to explain to you what they are doing or why. You have been advised that questions are welcome, and that you should ask them. You have also observed that the timing and context of questions matters enormously, that asking a question during the wrong moment in a ritual sequence produces a response that suggests the question itself is a minor theological error. You're developing a more careful sense of when questions are actually welcome, which appears to be mostly at the end of the day when everyone is tired and the sacred space has been properly closed. The smell is the thing you were not expecting. You knew there would be incense. Everyone who knows anything about Egyptian temples knows there is incense. What you are not prepared for is the density of it, the accumulated layers of smoke and resin and burning oil that have soaked into the stone over decades, possibly centuries, so that the walls themselves exhale something thick and fragrant and faintly suffocating when the morning fires are lit. The stone has absorbed so much of this over so long that it has become part of the material, a quality of the temple itself rather than an addition to it. You breathe it, and it is everywhere, inside your linen and your hair, and the passages of your nose in a way that you understand you will be carrying home with you at the end of the day. The Kaifi burns in the inner sanctums. Kifi is a compound incense of great complexity and closely guarded recipe, made from a formula of ingredients that is itself a piece of priestly knowledge not shared outside the relevant specialists. Ancient sources mention wine, honey, raisins, resin, myrrh, pine resin, aromatic plants, and a variable collection of other components depending on which temple and which period. The proportions and the preparation methods are the kind of knowledge that makes its holder valuable, and that is therefore not distributed freely. Its smoke curls upward through the lamplight in the inner halls in a way that looks intentional, as if the smoke knows its purpose and is performing it with the self-possession of something that has been doing this for a very long time. It smells extraordinary, in the way that extraordinary things sometimes smell, which is to say it smells like nothing else you have ever encountered, and also, after 2 hours of continuous exposure, like the early stages of a headache establishing itself somewhere behind your left eye, in a position it intends to occupy for the rest of the day. You carry a lamp through a corridor, and the lamp is necessary because in the inner areas of the temple, there is no natural light at all. The architects of these buildings designed the progression of spaces quite deliberately. The outer forecourt is open to the sky. The hyperstyle hall has clerestory windows that admit shafts of controlled light in specific patterns. The chambers beyond that have no windows. The sanctuary at the centre has absolutely none. As you move from the entrance of the temple toward its heart, you move from a space that participates in the ordinary world of sunlight and weather into a space that is categorically removed from it, sealed, dark, existing on a different plane from the world you came from. The darkness of the sanctuary is not an architectural oversight, it is a theological statement. The god does not need light. The god is the source and guardian of light, and sits in the sealed dark of the innermost chamber receiving the offerings that the priests bring in, offering in return the divine presence that makes the whole apparatus meaningful. You have not yet been permitted to enter the naos, the innermost shrine, because you do not yet hold the rank that permits it. But you have stood at the threshold of the outer sanctuary, and from there you can see the closed doors of the shrine, painted and gilded and perfectly still in the lamplight, and the quality of the space beyond those closed doors is something that is difficult to describe accurately using words calibrated for ordinary architectural experiences. It is not frightening, it is not comforting. It is the sensation of being in the presence of something that has been accumulated over an enormous amount of time, and that carries that accumulation in its stones in a way that is more physical than abstract. History pressed into rock. Intention pressed into rock. 3,000 years of daily ritual attention pressed into rock. You feel it in your body rather than your mind, and your body's response is a kind of respectful quieting that arrives without being asked for. You set your lamp in its designated niche, which was cut specifically for this purpose, and is positioned to illuminate without creating shadows in the areas where shadows would interfere with the ritual. The positioning of lamps in a temple is not casual. Everything about how a temple is lit reflects a system of attention that has been refined over generations. You back away from the threshold, facing the interior as you do, because turning your back on the sacred space is one of the prohibitions that was impressed on you on your first day with a clarity that has remained with you. You retreat to the corridor and continue your duties. The morning offerings are the centre of everything. The temple's fundamental purpose, beneath all of its theological complexity and political significance and architectural grandeur, is to maintain the relationship between the divine world and the human one through the daily performance of a set of material acts. The god in the shrine requires sustenance, requires attention, requires the specific ritual interactions that keep the divine presence engaged with the world rather than withdrawing from it. This is understood with complete literalness. The divine presence in the cult statue is real. The food placed before it is real. The clothing in which it is dressed is real linen. The oils with which it is anointed are real oils. The theological explanation for why a statue does not visibly eat is the concept of the ka, the spiritual double or vital force that absorbs the spiritual substance of the offering, while the physical substance remains, but the physical substance is presented with complete seriousness regardless. Every morning before the cult statue is unveiled, a complex sequence of ritual actions must be performed in the correct order, with the correct words by the correct people. The shrine is opened by a sem-priest, a rank senior to yours, who approaches the doors and breaks the clay seal that was pressed onto them the previous evening when the god was closed in for the night. The breaking of the seal is accompanied by specific words, a formulaic address that announces the arrival of the morning and the beginning of the new day's service. The doors are then swung open, and the deity within, in the person of the cult statue, is exposed to the lamplight and greeted with a formal invocation. Then comes water, offered in a specific vessel for the statue's symbolic washing. Then natron for purification. Then incense, carried in a censer, its smoke moving around the statue in a pattern prescribed by the ritual texts. Then the anointing with sacred oils, each oil chosen for its specific properties and associations, each applied in a specific sequence to specific locations, the whole process described in the lector priest text as a complex choreography of smell and substance and touch. The food follows, bread in many forms, each variety with a specific ritual name and significance. The long loaves called tiar, the small round loaves, the triangular loaves, the flat loaves, each from a different part of the temple's production cycle, each placed in a prescribed position on the offering table. Beer in jars, wine in other jars, water, milk, vegetables and fruits and bunches of flowers, cuts of meat from the cattle and fowl that are slaughtered in the temple's dedicated areas according to their own sequence of ritual requirements. Censers of incense alongside all of it, because the offering is presented in an atmosphere of incense as well as in the presence of the physical goods. The offering table on an ordinary day holds a substantial arrangement of goods. On a festival day, it can hold dozens of items, arranged in a pattern that is itself a hieroglyphic message, a visual statement about the generosity of the king who technically makes every offering on behalf of all Egyptians. This is where you spend your morning, carrying offerings from the outer storage halls to the intermediate chambers, transferring them into the hands of priests with the clearance to advance further. You are one link in a chain of people, each one passing things forward, each one at the boundary of their permitted territory. There is something about the system that is impeccably organised, and also, you're realising, designed to ensure that no single person below the highest ranks understands the full picture of what is happening. You see your portion of the process, you carry your portion of the goods, you interact with the people directly adjacent to you in the chain. The totality is managed by the people at the top. The high priest, whose title translates as first servant of the god, is the only person who enters the sanctuary regularly. He is the one who addresses the deity directly, who performs the central acts of opening and closing, who manages the divine relationship on behalf of the pharaoh. In the reliefs that decorate every temple wall, it is always the pharaoh who performs every ritual, the pharaoh who makes every offering, the pharaoh who kneels before every deity. This is theologically correct because the pharaoh is the official intermediary between humanity and the gods, the one person whose divine nature qualifies him to address the divine nature of the statue in the shrine. In practice, the pharaoh cannot be everywhere, and he delegates his ritual role to the high priest, who performs the rituals in pharaoh's name, while the wall reliefs continue to depict pharaoh performing them in person. The gap between the image and the reality is structural, built into the system, and accepted by everyone who operates within it as a functional convention rather than a deception. The sun climbs, and inside the temple, the cool of the early morning gives way to something that has designs on your well-being. The thick stone walls slow the heating process considerably, but they do not stop it, and by late morning, the nature of the air in the inner corridors has shifted from pleasantly cool to merely less hot than outside, a distinction that continues to narrow as the day progresses. Outside the temple walls, the Egyptian sun is performing its daily work with the commitment of something that has never taken a day off and does not intend to start now. You feel it first in the outer courts, when your duties take you back toward the entrance area, where the stone has been receiving direct sunlight for hours and has begun to reflect it back at you from below while it continues arriving from above. Then you feel it in the air itself, which has lost the quality of coolness it had at dawn, and replaced it with something denser, heavier, less cooperative with the idea of comfortable breathing. You are still working. The ritual cycle does not recognize temperature as a variable. The schedule was established by people who lived and died before anyone currently serving in this temple was born, and it has been observed continuously for so long that adjusting it for seasonal discomfort would require a kind of authority that nobody currently living wishes to claim. You move between the storage rooms and the offering halls, carrying, transferring, cleaning the residue of completed ritual sequences, preparing for the next. The linen you're wearing is doing what linen does in heat, which is to stick to you with an enthusiasm that linen fabric has for contact with warm skin, and to trap the sweat that your body is producing in its own attempts to manage the situation. The storage rooms are worth pausing on, because they are where you spend a significant portion of your time, and they are also where the temple's claims about its purely sacred nature meet the very concrete reality of institutional economics. The temple complex. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The temple complex is not simply a set of ritual halls arranged around a sanctuary. It is a functioning city, with an agricultural estate behind it that produces the goods it consumes, and a set of workshops and processing facilities that transform those agricultural products into the specific forms required by the ritual cycle. There are bakeries producing the specific types of bread that the offering table requires. There are breweries producing the beer. There are butcheries where the animals are slaughtered according to the prescribed sequence. There are textile workshops producing the linen for the priest's garments and the divine statue's dress. There are potters making the specific vessel types needed for ritual use. There are goldsmiths and other craftsmen maintaining the sacred objects. All of this is documented by scribes who sit in administrative offices and keep records of everything that moves through the system, the receipts and disbursements and assessments and accounts that constitute the paper infrastructure of an institution that never sleeps and never runs out of things to track. The administrative offices are not part of your current duties, but you are aware of them, and you are aware that the gap between the ritual world and the administrative world is thinner than the public presentation of the temple suggests. The people who keep the accounts and the people who burn the incense are sometimes the same people at different moments of the same day. The theological and the logistical are not two separate spheres but one complex reality, managed by the same institution and the same personnel. You eat at midday in the outer court, in the window between ritual cycles, sitting in a shadow that is doing its best with limited resources. The food is the reversion of offerings, the goods that were presented to the deity and then withdrawn, their spiritual substance absorbed, their physical substance redistributed to the temple staff as part of the complex compensation system that makes the temple economically functional. You are eating food that has been in the presence of the divine. This is an honour. You believe it is an honour. You also believe that it is bread and beer at midday in the heat, and that the honour and the heat are not entirely incompatible, but that they are also not the same thing, and that what you most want right now is the shade to be slightly larger. The afternoon ritual cycle follows the morning structure with variations that you are still learning. The mid-afternoon offering is shorter, more focused, a maintenance act rather than a grand gesture. The evening cycle is the mirror of the morning, working backward through the same sequence in reverse, closing what was opened, sealing what was unsealed, returning the deity to the privacy of the dark shrine for the night. The closing is performed with as much attention as the opening. The footprints of the officiating priest are swept from the sanctuary floor. Even the traces of human presence must be removed before the god is left alone, because the sanctuary in its closed state is supposed to be perfectly clear of any contamination, a space that has returned to its proper condition of divine purity. You participate in the sweeping. The brooms are specific, the strokes are specific, the direction is specific. You do it correctly on the first attempt and no one says anything. In this environment, you have learned to read silence as approval. But the sweeping is not the last thing that happens to you on your third day. The last thing that happens is something you were not told to expect, and it does not fit the category of tedious physical labour or ritual compliance or navigating the minefield of what not to ask. It happens in the corridor outside the outer sanctuary, after the closing is complete and the priests are beginning to filter toward the exits, when the particular quality of the evening in an enclosed stone space with a day's worth of incense smoke settled in the air creates something that has no ordinary name. You are checking a lamp that is positioned near the threshold of the outer sanctuary, making sure its oil level will carry it through the night. And in the process of doing this, you look up and find yourself standing alone in a corridor that is not quite dark and not quite lit, with the closed doors of the naos visible at the end of the sanctuary ahead of you, and the lamp in your hand casting its small, uncertain light on the carved walls on either side. The images on those walls are, as they have always been, saying their things to a reader who has the training to hear them. You do not yet have that training. but you can feel the weight of what they are saying regardless. The accumulated intent of the place, the sheer quantity of attention daily for generations that has been directed at this particular volume of space. You stand in that for a moment longer than your duties require. Then you back away correctly and go home. There is a rhythm to the days that you were not warned about, and it is more disorienting than you expected. Not the physical demands, which are considerable, and which your body is slowly beginning to accommodate through the unhappy process of adaptation that involves intermediate stages of complaining. Not the early hours, which your body is also slowly adapting to, with the similar intermediate stages. What you are not warned about is the way the days blend together. The ritual cycle is the same every day, and intentionally so because the entire theological purpose of the temple is the maintenance of a daily relationship with the divine that does not change because Monday was difficult or because you have developed a persistent cough from the incense smoke. The god requires exactly what the god required yesterday and will require tomorrow. This constancy is the point. It is the mechanism by which the cosmic order is maintained. But for the human beings inside the system, the constancy produces a particular quality of time that has no equivalent in the ordinary world outside. You notice it at the end of your first week. The days do not feel different from one another in the way that days outside the temple feel different, the way a market day feels different from a field day, the way a festival day feels different from an ordinary one. Inside the temple, the festival days are more elaborate versions of the ordinary days, more offerings, more priests, more careful attention to the sequence, but the sequence itself is the same sequence. The smell is the same smell. The stone is the same stone. The lamp in your hand is a different lamp than yesterday's, but it creates the same light in the same quality of darkness. You discover that this sameness produces something unexpected, which is a specific kind of attention. When the external context is always the same, you start to notice the internal variations. The quality of the stone under your feet on a day when there has been rain somewhere in the distance, the way the temperature in the outer court shifts in the hour before sunset, the particular quality of the silence in the corridor outside the outer sanctuary after the closing rituals are complete. Small things that would be invisible in an environment with more variety. Here they are visible because there is nothing else competing for your attention. The senior priests have this attention in a developed form. You can see it in the way they move through the space, the way they check certain positions of certain objects in the offering halls without appearing to look directly at them, the way they register the condition of the lamps and the state of the incense stocks without breaking the rhythm of their movement through the corridor. They have been inside this space for years and in some cases decades, and the accumulation of attention has produced something that looks from the outside like calm, but that from the inside is probably more like a kind of expertise in the temple's specific vocabulary of condition and change. You're still building your vocabulary. You learn, in the second week, the difference between the quality of incense smoke when the kifai has been prepared correctly and when it has been prepared with slightly stale ingredients. You learn the specific sound that the offering table makes when someone has placed a jar in the wrong position, not the wrong position according to ritual prescription, but the wrong position according to the simple physics of stable stacking, and the sound matters because a falling jar during the ritual sequence is not simply an inconvenience. You learn that there is a particular time of the afternoon, approximately 3 hours before sunset, when the light through the clear-story windows of the hypostyle hall reaches an angle that illuminates one specific section of wall relief for exactly long enough to make the colour of the paint visible in a way that the normal light does not achieve, and that senior priests sometimes pause in their duties during this window to look at the relief in question, not because they are shirking their responsibilities, but because the relief is one of the finest in the building, and the light makes it worth pausing for. The festival of Opet is when everything you have been learning about the ordinary temple rhythm is amplified into something you are genuinely not prepared for. Opet is the great festival of the renewal of the king's divine power, celebrated at Thebes during the second month of the inundation season, when the Nile is at its flood and the land is covered in water and the agricultural world is in its annual pause between the retreat of the water and the planting of the crops. For approximately 27 days, the cult statues of Amun, Mut, and their son Khonsu are carried in procession from the Temple of Karnak to the Temple of Luxor and back, travelling in their portable shrines on the sacred barks, carried on the shoulders of priests with the entire city turned out to watch and participate. The preparation for Opet begins weeks before the festival itself. The barks must be cleaned, inspected, and ritually purified. The cult statues must be prepared. The route of the procession must be maintained. The ritual meals and offerings required throughout the festival period must be organized, produced, and stored in readiness. The administrative machinery of the temple goes into a state of elevated activity that turns what is already a demanding operational environment into something considerably more so. You spend 3 days carrying pottery vessels from the temple's ceramic storage to the offering magazines. 3 days of back and forth that requires more attention to path clearing and traffic management than it requires of your ritual knowledge, which is limited, but which requires more physical effort than anything else you have done since arriving. The number of offerings required for a festival period of this length is staggering when converted into physical objects that must be moved and stored and then moved again. You develop, over these 3 days, a very specific and detailed understanding of how many steps separate the ceramic storage from the offering magazines, the number being considerably larger than seemed reasonable on the first day you made the journey. When the festival itself begins and the procession leaves the temple gates, you're positioned within the precinct to watch it pass. The barks are enormous, their gilded surfaces reflecting the light with an intensity that makes them difficult to look at directly. The priests who carry them move with the deliberate slow step of people bearing very significant weight over a very significant distance, and the weight is not only physical, the wooden structures and their contents are genuinely heavy, but also ceremonial, in the sense that every aspect of their bearing and their movement is under observation by the assembled population of the city and is required to communicate a specific quality of controlled sacred power. They succeed. Whatever the private reality of their experience, from the outside they look exactly like what the reliefs on the walls have been depicting them as looking like, which is an extraordinary alignment between representation and reality that does not always occur in institutional life, and that, when it does, produces its own kind of impression. You watch from the precinct doing your duties, which on festival days include a set of specific contributions to the maintenance of the ritual space within the walls, while the main action is happening outside them. The temple during the Opet procession is both more full and more empty than usual, the paradox of a festival that draws the most important sacred objects out of the sanctuary, while filling the outer spaces with the noise and movement of preparation and support. You carry things. You light lamps. You perform the cleaning duties appropriate to your rank in a temple that is simultaneously engaged in its most visible public ceremony and its most elaborate private ritual activities. On the day that the barkers return from Luxor, you're positioned close enough to the processional route to feel, in your body, the approach of the procession before you can see it. The music precedes the barks, the sound of sistrums and drums and the rhythmic chanting of priests that carries over the distance with a quality that is different from ordinary sound, in the way that organized sound always differs from ambient sound, and that creates in the people who hear it approaching a kind of alert attention, a stillness that is not absence of response but its preparation. Then the barks come into view, and the response of the crowd is not a single sound but a layered one, a complex mixture of religious devotion and ordinary human excitement, and the particular kind of collective emotion that occurs when a large number of people are experiencing the same thing simultaneously and are aware of being part of something larger than their individual experience. You feel it too. Despite 3 weeks of learning that the temple is a system involving early mornings and natron rinses and the careful avoidance of certain categories of animal product, you feel it. The accumulated weight of the tradition, of everything that the procession represents and everything that it has represented for the hundreds of years it has been happening, is present in the moment and available to you in the way that presence is always available when something has been done the same way for long enough that the doing has become part of the place itself. This is what you are not warned about at the beginning, and it would have been difficult to describe even if someone had tried. Not the physical demands, not the ritual requirements, not the hierarchy and the purification and the incense headaches, but this, that proximity to something this old and this continuous does something to how you understand your own position in time. You're a very small and replaceable element in a system that has been running since before your family's memory extends in any direction, and will continue running after your grandchildren's grandchildren are gone. But you're also, specifically and exactly, in this place, at this moment, participating in a continuity that has its own kind of weight and its own kind of value. The two things are both true simultaneously, and learning to hold them both at once is part of what this work is teaching you, though nobody has said so directly and nobody will. There is a story about a woman who should not have been pharaoh, which makes her absolutely ordinary by the standards of Egyptian political history, except that she actually became one, which makes her extraordinary by any standard you care to apply. Her name was Hatshepsut. She ruled Egypt for approximately 22 years during the 18th dynasty of the New Kingdom period, roughly 1500 years before the Common Era. And the fact that we know her name at all, that we can say it now with reasonable confidence and attach it to a set of documented achievements and a partially surviving mummy, and a dental record that served as the final evidence of her identity, is something of a small miracle. Because after her death, someone tried very hard to ensure that her name would not survive. She was born into the royal family at a moment of particular Egyptian energy. Her father was Thutmose I, one of the more aggressive and successful pharaohs of the early 18th dynasty, a man who had pushed Egypt's military reach further north into the Levant and further south into Nubia than most of his predecessors, and who had returned from his campaigns with the wealth and prestige that come from military effectiveness successfully performed. His court at Thebes was a place of ambition and activity, shaped by a ruler who understood the relationship between military power and political authority, and who cultivated both with considerable skill. By all available evidence, Thutmose I had a genuine affection for his eldest daughter. She accompanied him on ritual occasions. She's depicted in certain temple scenes in a role suggesting official participation rather than ceremonial decoration. She was educated in the manner expected of a royal child, which in Egypt meant exposure to the formal literary traditions of the court, to the religious and administrative texts that governed the functioning of the kingdom, to the complex ceremonial life that surrounded the pharaonic office, and that required its practitioners to know an enormous amount about how things were done and why. She grew up inside power, understanding its textures and its requirements from the inside rather than as an external observer. She married her half-brother Thutmose II, which was the expected arrangement for someone of her position in the royal family at the time. Egypt had developed its own logic of royal intermarriage, one that prioritized the concentration of royal blood as a theological and political stabilizing mechanism, and that logic had been operating for long enough that it felt less like a choice and more like a natural feature of royal succession. Thutmose II became pharaoh. Hatshepsut became the great royal wife, the highest-ranking queen in the kingdom, positioned at the centre of the court's ceremonial life, formally present at the major religious festivals, theoretically influential in ways that the record is not always clear about. The marriage was not long. Thutmose II's reign was relatively brief, and not particularly distinctive by the standards of the 18th dynasty, which was producing strong rulers with some regularity. He died, and the succession passed to the child who would become Thutmose III. This child was the son of Thutmose II by a secondary wife, not by Hatshepsut, and he was young at the time of his father's death, young enough that governing independently was not an option. When a minor pharaoh needed governance that he could not provide himself, Egypt's precedent was for a senior royal woman to act as regent, making decisions in the young pharaoh's name while he was prepared for eventual independent rule. Hatshepsut assumed this role, and by the available evidence she performed it with competence. The administration continued, the economy functioned, the temples received their offerings, the borders were maintained. For approximately 7 years this arrangement persisted, and then something changed in the record. The exact nature and mechanism of the change is one of the genuine open questions in the study of this period, and the honest answer is that the surviving evidence does not provide a clear account of a specific moment or decision. What the record shows is a result rather than a process. Hatshepsut ceased to appear in the records as regent and began to appear as pharaoh, with the full titulary, the full royal names, the complete suite of pharaonic authority. The 5-part royal name that every pharaoh carried was not simply a label, it was a theological declaration. Each component addressed a different aspect of the king's divine status and cosmic function. The Horus name identified the pharaoh as the living embodiment of the hawk god who was the divine patron of kingship. The two ladies' name connected the pharaoh to the protective deities of Upper and Lower Egypt. The golden Horus name addressed the pharaoh's relationship to the solar cycle. The praenomen nomen, the throne name and birth name enclosed in cartouches, were the most personal identifiers, the names by which a pharaoh was most commonly called in formal contexts. Hatshepsut took all 5. She assembled a royal titulary that claimed every aspect of the pharaonic office, and she used it. The question of how this was represented visually is one of the things that makes her reign so interesting to think about. The pharaonic role was theologically defined as male. The king was the son of the solar creator, the embodiment of Horus, the one who would become Osiris. The entire theological framework of divine kingship had been developed around a male body and male succession, and the images and texts associated with the office reflected this. The regalia, the false beard, the double crown, the crook and flail were not simply symbols of power, but components of a theological statement about the king's nature and identity. Hatshepsut's official images navigate this situation in ways that have generated significant scholarly discussion. In some images, she's represented with the full male regalia, the false beard, the masculine body type conventional for royal representations, in a form that is following the iconographic rules of pharaonic representation without modification. In others, the body is more clearly female while the regalia remains royal. In some inscriptions, the grammatical forms used to describe her actions shift between masculine and feminine within the same text, as if the scribal tradition was finding its own accommodation with a situation the stylistic conventions had not anticipated. The variation across her monuments suggests that neither she nor the officials and artists who served her had settled on a single definitive solution, and that the visual program of her reign was being worked out pragmatically, case by case, in response to the specific context in which each image or text appeared. She did not, as far as the evidence allows us to determine, attempt to remove Thutmose III from the picture. He continued to hold his royal title. He appeared in official contexts. The arrangement was a co-regency, with 2 people holding the pharaonic office simultaneously, a pattern that had occurred before in Egyptian history, even if the specific gender configuration was unprecedented. For most of the 22 years of her effective reign, the co-regency appears to have functioned well enough that the external record does not suggest serious instability. Egypt was not collapsing. The temples were receiving their due. The administrative machinery was running. Whatever tensions existed within the royal relationship, they were managed without producing visible disruption. What she did with the power she claimed is where the story becomes genuinely remarkable. Building programs in ancient Egypt were how rulers expressed their relationship to the divine world and their claim to historical memory, and Hatshepsut built at a scale and quality that was exceptional even within a dynasty that had elevated large-scale royal construction to something close to a competitive sport. Her works were numerous and ambitious, distributed across the major religious centers of Egypt, adding to or transforming existing sacred spaces in ways that left her name and her image in the most permanent medium available. At Karnak, the enormous temple complex at Thebes that was continuously expanded over centuries by successive pharaohs, each eager to add their own structures and claims to its already immense fabric, she built chapels, gateways, and colonnaded halls. She erected obelisks, including 2 of the largest that Egypt had yet produced, their tips sheathed in electrum, an alloy of gold and silver, so that they would catch the first light of the rising sun each morning and reflect it across the city. In an inscription associated with one of these obelisks, she describes her intention to create something that would outlast ordinary time, to make the 2 great obelisks at the entrance of the sanctuary flash with rays at the face of the god. The language of permanence and divine function is everywhere in how she talked about what she was building, because that is the register of royal inscription. But there is also, in some of her texts, a quality of personal investment that goes somewhat beyond formula, a sense that these were not simply conventional gestures, but expressions of something she specifically wanted to create and claim. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari is the achievement most visible to modern visitors and most clearly demonstrative of the quality of her ambitions. It stands on the west bank of the Nile, set into the base of the dramatic limestone cliffs that bound the Theban necropolis, and it is designed in a series of colonnaded terraces rising in stages from the valley floor to the cliff face, connected by broad ramps, each level opening in a long row of columns that creates a rhythm of verticals against the horizontal mass of the rock behind it. The scale is right, the proportions are right, the relationship between the built structure and the natural cliff is right, in a way that suggests the design was worked out with an understanding of the total composition rather than just the individual elements. It was designed by an official named Senenmut, who held a series of positions in Hatshepsut's administration that gave him oversight of her major building projects, and who was clearly a figure of exceptional capability and influence. Senenmut's relationship with Hatshepsut has been a subject of speculation for approximately 2,000 years. An ancient graffiti found in the hills above Deir el-Bahri suggests the speculation was already in progress during his own lifetime. The drawings are not subtle in their implications. Whether the relationship was what the graffiti suggested is not something the surviving record can confirm or definitively deny. What the record does show clearly is that Senenmut had access to Hatshepsut's court that went beyond what his official title strictly required. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. That his influence on the design and execution of her building program was substantial, and that his career ended abruptly and without clear explanation before Hatshepsut's own death, a disappearance from the record that has generated its own long tradition of speculation about what happened and why. The walls of the mortuary temple carry the record of her reign in relief and colour. One section depicts the trading expedition to the land of Punt, a semi-mythological place that Egyptian texts had been mentioning since the Old Kingdom as a source of incense and exotic goods, located somewhere to the south and east in a direction that modern scholars have connected to the Horn of Africa region, with various specific candidates for the exact location still under discussion. The expedition Hatshepsut organised was not the first Egyptian contact with Punt, but it was apparently exceptional in scale and success, and the decision to commemorate it in permanent relief on the walls of her most important monument suggests that she considered it one of the defining achievements of her reign. The reliefs show the Egyptian ships arriving off a foreign coast, the exchange of goods, the loading of myrrh trees, incense, ebony, ivory, animal skins and live animals onto the ships for transport back to Egypt, and the return journey culminating in the presentation of the expedition's results to Hatshepsut herself, who receives them in a context that places her on equal footing with the gods before whom the offerings are ultimately destined. The foreign ruler depicted in the Punt reliefs, a figure called the Chief of Punt, appears alongside a woman whose physical form the reliefs rendered with a frankness about obesity that the Egyptians were quite comfortable including in their art when they considered it descriptive rather than insulting. Whether the representation was accurate or conventional is impossible to know, but it is one of the more specific pieces of documentary evidence about what Punt looked like to Egyptian eyes, and it has been generating comment since the reliefs were first examined by modern scholars. There are also the texts. Hatshepsut's inscriptions have a quality of personal address that is somewhat distinctive. Egyptian royal inscriptions follow conventions that are consistent across centuries, because consistency is part of what makes them valid as royal statements. But within those conventions there is room for individual variation, and Hatshepsut's texts sometimes suggest a voice that is paying attention to the audience in a particular way. She addresses future readers directly in some inscriptions, anticipating that they might find her reign surprising, and offering her own explanation of its legitimacy. She describes herself as acting in accordance with the will of the god Amun, as having been called to the kingship by divine selection, rather than simply assuming it by force or circumstance. The divine legitimation is a standard element of royal rhetoric, but the specificity with which she develops it across her monuments suggests that she was conscious of the need to argue for her position in ways that a male pharaoh with conventional succession would not have needed to. There is an inscription from Deir el-Bahri in which she addresses whoever will read it in a future she cannot see, telling them to attend to what she has done for the divine house, instructing them that she made the temple anew and that what she built will endure, that the stones will speak for her long after she's gone. The confidence of the claim and the awareness behind it that she was making an argument to a future that might need convincing sits in the record as one of the more human moments in an otherwise formal genre. She was buried in the Valley of the Kings. Her tomb was modified during her reign to accommodate the new status she'd assumed, its floor cut deeper to move the burial chamber further into the rock, the better to accommodate the larger sarcophagus appropriate for a pharaoh rather than a queen. She had also prepared a tomb of the traditional queenly type on the east slope of the valley, designated KV-60, a smaller and earlier preparation that she eventually used for different purposes as her royal identity solidified. The details of what was in these tombs and how they were arranged tell their own story about the process of her becoming what she became, the pragmatic adjustments made in the existing structures of a role that was adapting itself to her situation as it went. Thutmose III became sole pharaoh after her death. He reigned for many additional years, and his reign was remarkable in its own right, characterized by a series of military campaigns in the Levant and Nubia that extended Egypt's reach and influence further than almost any previous rulers had. He became the model against which later Egyptian military kings measured themselves, and the records of his campaigns are preserved in the annals inscribed on the walls of the Karnak temple in a detail that reflects both the significance of the campaigns and the care with which he wanted them remembered. He was a capable and intelligent ruler, and the administration of Egypt under his long sole reign was evidently effective. For the first 2 decades of his sole reign, the record does not suggest any systematic campaign against Hatshepsut's memory. She had been buried, her monument stood, her name appeared in records, the world continued. And then, late in Thutmose III's reign, probably in the final decade of what was a very long reign indeed, something began to happen to her monuments. Her name started disappearing from inscriptions, chiseled away with the methodical attention of workers executing a specific program rather than vandals acting impulsively. Her images and temple reliefs were carved out or plastered over. Her statues at Deir el-Bahari were removed and smashed, their fragments deposited in pits within the temple precincts in a careful discard rather than a random destruction. The cartouches that had borne her royal names were refilled with the names of the male pharaohs of her dynasty: her father Thutmose I, her husband Thutmose II, her co-regent Thutmose III himself, filling in the succession line so that it appeared unbroken and conventionally male. The program was not perfectly executed. The workers were not able to reach everything, and some images and inscriptions survived either through inaccessibility or through simple oversight. The obelisks at Karnak, too large to demolish without great effort, were enclosed within masonry structures that hid them without destroying them, a solution that preserved them by accident because the masonry turned out to be more protective than the open air would have been. The statue pits at Deir el-Bahari preserved her best surviving works because the excavation and burial was a more careful act of disposal than simple exposure, and what the desert dry air preserved for 3,000 years was found by archaeologists in the early 20th century in a state that allowed them to understand something of what the original program had tried to eliminate. Why? This is the question that has generated the most sustained discussion, and the honest answer is that certainty is not available. The most common initial interpretation was personal, that Thutmose III finally acted on decades of resentment against the stepmother who had sidelined him during his regency years, seeking in old age the revenge that political caution had prevented him from taking earlier. This interpretation is emotionally satisfying and historically thin. If Thutmose III resented Hatshepsut, he had the power and the opportunity to express that resentment from the moment of her death onward, and did not. Whatever the motivation for the erasure, it was not simple anger undeferred. A more structurally grounded interpretation focuses on the succession. Thutmose III, in the late years of his reign, was preparing the transition to his own heir, his son Amenhotep II. The dynastic lineage that would be inherited by Amenhotep included in its official version the record of Hatshepsut's pharaonic reign, and that record contained a precedent, the precedent of a woman successfully holding the pharaonic office. Removing that precedent from the official succession record, making the lineage appear as a continuous line of male kings, without the anomaly of a female pharaoh breaking its pattern, was a form of dynastic housekeeping that secured the future by rewriting the past. This interpretation treats the erasure as a project of institutional management rather than personal revenge, which makes it considerably less dramatic and considerably more plausible. There is also a theological dimension that the structural interpretation alone does not fully capture. The pharaoh was not simply a political ruler. The pharaoh was a theological entity, the embodiment of specific divine principles in a specific cosmic role. That role was defined as male, not as a preference but as a feature of the theology. Hatshepsut's reign was a functioning anomaly, a female person performing a male theological role, and the tensions in how she was represented visually and textually reflect the genuine conceptual difficulty of that situation. After her death, with no immediate political need to maintain the anomaly's legitimacy, there may have been a strong theological motive to close the precedent, not because she had done something wrong, but because the theology needed the precedent not to exist. For 3,000 years, roughly, the erasure largely worked. Hatshepsut existed in the historical record as a confusing presence, a set of royal cartouches from which names had been removed, inscriptions with female grammatical forms attached to what appeared to be male pharaonic imagery, a gap in the dynastic sequence that did not quite add up. European scholars who began the serious reconstruction of Egyptian history in the 18th and 19th centuries found her puzzling and slow to correctly identify. The Egyptologist James Henry Breasted, working in the early 20th century, was among the first to clearly understand what the confused record was describing, and the reconstruction of her reign has continued and deepened in the century since. Her mummy's identification in the early years of the 21st century came through a combination of DNA analysis, computed tomography scanning, and a very specific piece of physical evidence. A canopic box bearing her name was found to contain, among other things, a tooth. An examination of a mummy long believed to be a royal nurse found in the same tomb where she had been placed, a tomb designated KV60 in the Valley of the Kings, revealed that the mummy had an empty socket in its jaw. The tooth from the canopic box fit that socket. The identification, achieved through a detail so specific that it is almost comically precise, was accepted by the specialist community, and Hatshepsut was formally returned to her place in the record. She had wanted to be remembered in stone. The stone had survived, imperfectly but sufficiently, and a tooth completed what the stone had not quite managed alone. There is something about that which she herself would have understood. She had paid attention throughout her reign to the relationship between what you build and what outlasts you. She had written to future readers across a gap she knew would be long. She had built in a material that time could diminish but not eliminate. The 3,000 years between her tooth and its identification were not what she had intended, and the path her memory took was not the path she had planned, but she had survived it. The chisels had not been the last word. Before that burial, though, the reign itself demands a fuller accounting. The administrative reality of governing a complex state across 2 decades, while managing the unprecedented tensions of her position, was not made up only of building campaigns and trading expeditions. It was made up of the daily correspondence with provincial administrators, of decisions about resource allocation, of responses to petitions that flowed upward through the bureaucratic hierarchy from every corner of the kingdom. It was made up of managing the temple economies that were the financial infrastructure of the state, of overseeing the agricultural system whose reliable functioning determined whether the population ate adequately, of decisions about military readiness and border management, and the relationships with neighbouring powers that required constant attention. Hatshepsut managed all of this. The evidence for this is partly the simple fact that Egypt did not collapse during her reign, which sounds like faint praise but is not, because a state of Egypt's complexity in the middle of the 2nd millennium, before the Common Era, required constant active management to remain functional. It is also in the traces of administrative activity in the documents that survive, tax records and temple accounts, and administrative correspondence showing a bureaucratic system functioning under active oversight. She was not a figurehead who had assumed a title. She was a working head of state who was doing the work. She managed her own image with a sophistication that reflects a genuinely political mind. The program of official art and inscription she produced over her reign was a sustained argument for the legitimacy of her position, made in the vocabulary of Egyptian royal ideology and addressed to multiple audiences simultaneously, the gods, who were the ultimate audience of all pharaonic self-presentation, the educated class of officials and priests who could read the argument in full, future pharaohs who would encounter her monuments and need to understand the claim they made. The argument was, I was chosen by Amun. The evidence of my divine mandate is the prosperity and order of my reign. The logic was circular in the way that all royal legitimation in Egypt was circular, but within those conventions she deployed the argument with skill, and the monuments she left behind are some of the more persuasive entries in the long Egyptian tradition of pharaonic self-presentation. The relationship with Senenmut is worth returning to briefly, not because the personal question can be resolved at this distance, but because the professional relationship is striking and under-examined. He held an extraordinary range of official titles in her administration, overseeing the royal household, her daughter Neferu's education, the major building projects. He appears in the reliefs of the mortuary temple in small hidden images of himself, tucked into corners and doorways in positions that could be seen by those who looked carefully. but that were not part of the official decorative program. Whether this was affection, ego, the presumption of someone who understood his name would be associated with this building indefinitely, or something else entirely is not determinable. What it demonstrates is a relationship specific enough and unusual enough that his contemporaries noticed it, as the graffiti in the hills suggests they did. He disappears from the record before her death, without explanation, and the records do not provide the explanation. The story of Hatshepsut belongs to the highest level of Egyptian power, to the politics of the royal court and the theology of divine kingship. But the most intimate and human records that ancient Egypt left us about what working inside that civilization actually felt like on a daily basis come from somewhere considerably more modest. They come from a limestone plateau, a dry valley, and a village of craftsmen whose relationship to the secrets of their civilization was more immediate and specific than almost anyone else in the kingdom. On the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, in a narrow natural depression in the limestone plateau that faces away from the river and is sealed from the ordinary inhabited landscape by the ridges on every side, the Egyptian state maintained a community of workers whose purpose was to cut, decorate, and finish the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. They called the place Set Mut, the place of truth. Scholars and archaeologists know it as Deir el-Medina. The workers who lived there were called the servants in the place of truth, and because the desert that surrounded their village was so extraordinarily dry that organic materials survived there for over 3,000 years, and because the inhabitants of that village were literate in proportions unusual for their time, and because they apparently considered writing things down a worthwhile response to almost every situation, the documentary record they left behind is one of the most detailed and intimate archives of non-royal daily life from the ancient world. Papyri, ostraca, legal records, personal letters, work journals, accounts of disputes, lists of absent workers and the reasons for their absence, notes on medical treatments, records of the distribution of goods and the management of the community's internal affairs. All of it is there, preserved in the dry limestone rock and the dry desert air, waiting for the archaeologists who would eventually find it and spend the better part of the 20th century working out what it said. You're one of the servants in the place of truth now. You wake in the dark in a house that is small and organised with the specific intelligence of people who have been making the most of limited space for a long time. The house is built of limestone rubble and Nile mud brick, plastered smooth inside, kept clean with the practical discipline of people who understand that the alternative to cleanliness in a community this size is disease. 2 or 3 rooms, each with a purpose. The front room for work and eating and receiving the small social interactions that make up ordinary daily life. The inner room or rooms for sleeping. Sometimes a cellar, accessible through a trapdoor in the floor, used for storage and occasionally for the small domestic religious practices that are distinct from the grand temple religion happening on the other side of the ridge. The front room contains evidence of the household economy. A loom against one wall, because weaving is one of the ways your wife contributes to the household's material wealth, producing linen that can be used within the family or traded within the community for things that are needed. Ceramic vessels of various sizes for storage and cooking. A low table and the remnants of last evening's meal. A small ancestor bust in a corner niche. The image of a remembered family member whose spirit is addressed in the household rituals that connect the living to the dead, in the ongoing relationship that Egyptian religion expected from both sides of that boundary. Your wife is already awake. In the world of Deir el-Medina, women are not peripheral figures, and they are not defined entirely by their relationship to their husbands in the documentary record. The ostraca and papyri from this community include letters sent by women and received by women, legal cases brought by women on their own behalf, property transactions managed by women, accounts maintained by women. They borrow grain and lend it. They own houses and inherit land. They testify in the village tribunal, and their testimony is recorded with the same administrative seriousness as men's. The community's internal economy, in which goods and services circulate constantly through a system of exchange that supplements the state rations, involves women as active participants rather than as dependents of their husband's economic activity. You know this about your household because it is simply the reality of how the community works, and your wife's management of the household's portion of that reality is a practical function that you would not want to do without. Breakfast is quick and good. The bread your household makes comes from the grain that is part of your state ration, distributed by the necropolis administration on a regular schedule that, when it works properly, provides enough to feed your family and leave a small surplus for exchange. It is made by people who know what they are doing with it, which makes it considerably better than the bread that the temple produces for the ritual offerings, despite the ritual offering bread's theological advantage. The beer is thick and nutritious in the way that Egyptian beer is, less a luxury than a caloric staple. You eat quickly because the day is already beginning in the sense that the faint lightening in the sky above the ridge tells you it is beginning, and the path over the ridge to the valley is not a short one. You gather your tools. The copper chisels of several sizes, each for a different type of work, maintained by the village's metal workers and replaceable through the administrative supply chain when they wear beyond usefulness. The wooden mallet, heavy enough to drive the chisel effectively without being so heavy that a day of swinging it becomes a separate problem from the work itself. The lamp, a simple ceramic vessel with a wick and animal fat, the light source without which the work in the deeper parts of the tomb would be impossible. The water skin, because the valley has no water, and the difference between arriving with sufficient water and arriving without is the difference between an afternoon you can endure and one you cannot. The path over the ridge has been worn smooth by generations of workers making exactly this journey at exactly this time, and in the pre-dawn light it is a thin, pale line against the darker limestone, visible enough to follow without thinking about it. You have been following it for long enough that your feet know it better than your eyes do, know the places where the path narrows and you need to step carefully, know the loose section near the top of the ridge where the rock is less stable, know the spot just before the crest where the wind, if there is wind, typically hits you first. You crest the ridge and the Valley of the Kings opens below you, and you begin the descent. In the early morning, before the sun has had time to heat the pale cliff faces to their daytime operating temperature, the valley has a quality that is difficult to describe to someone who knows it only from photographs and tourist accounts. The cliffs rise on all sides, cutting the sky into a shape that changes as you move. The entrances to the tombs are visible in the cliff faces, sealed with limestone rubble and the marks of the necropolis administration, some of them obviously old from the patina of the rubble and the weathering of the plaster seals, others more recent. The silence is specific, the silence of a place that is deliberately closed, that has been made to hold what is inside it, rather than participate in the ordinary noise of the world. You know what is inside them. This is the fact about your life that ordinary Egyptians do not fully appreciate, or are perhaps deliberately not invited to appreciate. The guards who watch the valley entrances know that tombs exist and that they should not be opened by unauthorized persons. The administrators of the necropolis know the locations and have the records. The priests who perform the mortuary rituals know the prayers and the sequences. But you know the dimensions of the burial chambers. You know the layout of the corridors and the positions of the subsidiary chambers. You know what was in the last supply delivery to the working face, and therefore something about the materials being used in the current tomb's decoration. You know which part of the cliff face is being cut now, and approximately how deep the current work has gone. You carry this knowledge as a practical feature of your employment, and you have carried it for long enough that it no longer impresses you with its weight. It is simply what you know, the way a quarryman knows the geology of his quarry, present and specific and unremarkable from the inside. You descend into the current working tomb, and the air changes within the first few steps. The desert heat that is already beginning to accumulate in the valley at ground level disappears behind the transition into enclosed stone, replaced by the dense, still atmosphere of a cut that has been sealed except for its entrance. In the early morning this air is cool, carrying the residual cooling from the night, and for the first hour of work it is something that your body accepts without complaint. This will change. The work team is mostly assembled when you arrive, the right side and left side teams taking their positions at the working face, where yesterday's cutting ended. The foreman has already been down to check the alignment, the plumb lines and stretched cords confirming that the corridor is proceeding in the direction specified by the plan, the gradient measured against the established specification. This is not casual work. Royal tombs are cut to architectural designs that are themselves theological documents, the sequence of corridors and chambers and their dimensions and orientations, not simply functional, but meaningfully arranged in a way that reflects the theological understanding of the passage from the world to the underworld and back again. Getting the dimensions wrong cutting the corridor in the wrong direction, failing to achieve the specified relationship between one chamber and another is not just a construction error. It is a theological one, a failure of the sacred space to be what it is supposed to be. The sound of copper chisels on limestone fills the corridor within seconds of the work beginning, a rhythmic striking that reverberates in the enclosed space with a clarity and fullness that open-air work does not produce. You feel it in your body as much as you hear it, the vibration of the mallet through the chisel handle into your hand and up your arm, the response of the rock as it resists and then gives way and then resists again. Limestone is not a uniform material. It has layers and bands and variations in hardness that change the character of the work from one section to the next. And there are the flint nodules embedded in the matrix that can turn up without warning and that require specific responses, a change of angle, a lighter blow, sometimes a different chisel entirely. The dust rises with every strike and settles everywhere. Fine limestone. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Fine limestone powder, pale grey-white, accumulating on your clothing and your hair, and the back of your hand and the rim of your lamp vessel, and the walls you have just cut. You breathe it constantly. Every breath in the working area is a breath that contains some percentage of ground limestone, and this has been true of every working day of your career, and will continue to be true of every working day that remains. The skeletal evidence from the workers of Deir el-Medina shows the effects of this in bone changes associated with respiratory conditions, and the administrative records include entries for workers absent due to illness that correspond to what modern medicine would identify as the consequences of chronic occupational dust exposure. You do not have a modern understanding of the mechanism. You know that some of your colleagues develop persistent coughs and seem somehow diminished over the years, and you hope you're not one of them, and you drink your water when you can and try to breathe carefully and continue working. The conversation among the team continues throughout the day at the low, easy level of people who have been working together long enough that silence is comfortable, but talk is better. There is extensive discussion of the grain delivery that has been late for 3 days running now. The conversation about the late grain is not new today. It has been the central topic of the team's collective attention since the delivery failed to arrive on schedule, and it has acquired the quality of a problem that is being actively monitored rather than passively waiting. 3 days without the full ration is the kind of situation that the community has formal responses to, and those responses are being discussed and prepared. The discussion of whether this lateness represents a temporary supply chain problem or the beginning of a larger administrative failure is sophisticated, informed by the community's long experience with the necropolis administration and its variable reliability, and it has the quality of institutional knowledge being applied to an evolving situation by people who are not simply frustrated, but are thinking strategically. There is also discussion of a property dispute between 2 village families that is coming before the village tribunal, the Kenbet, the local court that handles the community's internal legal affairs. The Deir el-Medina community had its own judicial apparatus, and this apparatus was used extensively and seriously. The Kenbet could hear cases, adjudicate disputes, impose penalties, and its decisions were recorded. The archive of legal documents from this community includes records of property disputes, debt cases, theft accusations, marriage settlements, inheritance agreements, cases involving unpaid loans of grain and tools and clothing, cases involving the boundaries of houses and the ownership of specific objects, including repeatedly donkeys. The donkeys appear in the legal record with a frequency that reflects their economic importance as working animals and the consequent significance of disputes about who owns them. You have been involved in one donkey-adjacent dispute in your career, not regarding the animal's ownership but regarding a debt that was to be paid partly in grain and partly in the use of a donkey, and the process of resolving it through the Kenbet was satisfying in the way that official processes that take you seriously are satisfying, even when the outcome was not entirely what you had hoped. Midday arrives and the team climbs to the entrance, and the valley at midday in the hot season is precisely what you expect it to be, which is not a pleasant surprise. The pale cliff faces have been absorbing solar energy for several hours and are now returning it. The air above the valley floor shimmers. The lack of vegetation, shade, or any feature that might moderate the thermal environment means the heat is complete, and the idea that there might be some pocket of coolness nearby is not supported by evidence. You sit in the thin shadow of a rock formation and eat quickly, the bread and dried fish and whatever else was sent down, and drink your water slowly, and watch the valley with the eyes of someone who knows its contents and is not particularly awed by its exterior. Afternoons underground become, as the season progresses, a study in the accumulation of heat in enclosed spaces. The air in the corridor does not circulate. It sits, and over the course of the day it accumulates the warmth produced by the oil lamps, and by the bodies of the workers and by the heat, conducting through the limestone from the sun-baked surface above. By mid-afternoon, the working environment is warm in a way that requires active management, a slower pace, more frequent water breaks, a conscious attention to the warning signs that your body sends when it is being asked to work in conditions that are approaching the limit of what it can sustain without complaint. You cut. You carry the debris backward in baskets. You check the alignment of the current stroke against the line. You sharpen your chisel at the edge of the working face when the edge dulls, a skill that has its own technique and that the careless application of would result in a chisel that is geometrically wrong as well as dull. You talk, you listen, you do your portion of the work, and the corridor extends by the amount it extends in a day, which is measurable and measured by the foreman at the end of the shift, and recorded in the administrative documents that the scribes of the necropolis keep for exactly this purpose. You know things that almost nobody outside this valley knows. You know the locations of the sealed royal tombs. You know that the record of your community includes episodes of tomb robbery, that in the troubled years of the late 20th dynasty, when the central government was weakening and the grain deliveries had become erratic, and the administrative structure that was supposed to support the community was failing in ways that were increasingly difficult to excuse as temporary disruption, some members of this community, and some connected to it, had used their knowledge in ways that were not officially sanctioned. The investigations of those robberies, the trials and the punishments recorded in the papyri that survive from that period are part of the community's own history, and the community does not forget them. You do not use your knowledge that way. The combination of reasonable wages, legal protections, community identity, and a genuine sense of the sacred significance of the work you do constitutes a sufficient arrangement of incentives and meaning to keep the boundary between legitimate and illegitimate use of what you know where it is supposed to be. Most people in Deir el-Medina made the same calculation and kept the same boundary. The robberies happened at the margins when the official system failed badly enough that the arrangement of incentives broke down. This is not a reassuring observation about human nature, it is an accurate one. You go home over the ridge in the evening, and the path that was dark when you crossed it this morning is now lit by the low light of late afternoon, the limestone pale gold in the specific quality of Egyptian afternoon light that makes everything look like it is slightly more itself than it usually is. Your legs know the descent the way they know the ascent, with the particular automaticity of a route travelled so many times that the feet make their own decisions while the mind occupies itself elsewhere. You're thinking about the working face, about a section of the cut that gave you trouble this afternoon, about the angle of the chisel that will be necessary tomorrow to address the flint nodule you encountered near the end of the day without losing too much of the surrounding limestone to unnecessary breakage. Your wife has news about the grain delivery, which is still late, and which the community is preparing to address through formal channels. The community's response to supply failures has been formalized over the years into a recognizable procedure, one that begins with internal discussion among the senior workers and the foreman, proceeds to a formal petition addressed to the necropolis scribes, and escalates if necessary to the direct appearance of the workers at the administrative offices. The petition is already being drafted, and its language, you have been told, is direct in a way that reflects genuine frustration while remaining within the boundaries of what an official communication can say. There is a skill to this, to expressing urgency without expressing the anger that underlies it, and the community has developed that skill over generations of dealing with an administrative apparatus that responds to formal requests more reliably than to emotional ones. There is also news about the tribunal case, which is proceeding, and about a neighbour's household whose youngest child has been ill for several days, which is a concern. Illness in a community this tight moves through it, with a speed that the walls of houses do not significantly impede, and the community has its own practices for managing this, some of which are medical in the sense of involving herbal treatments and specific foods, and some of which are religious in the sense of involving prayers to the goddess Taweret, the hippopotamus-bodied protector of households and children, whose image sits in several households in the village in the form of a small ceramic figurine kept in the position of a household deity. The line between the medical and the religious management of illness in Deir el-Medina is not a line that the community would have recognised as a meaningful distinction. Both are practical responses to a practical problem, and both are deployed because both are available. You eat, you talk. You have a small dispute about something that will not be remembered clearly in the morning, the kind of dispute that is less about its nominal subject and more about the particular quality of end-of-day tiredness that inhabits both of you and makes edges sharper than they need to be. The dispute resolves, as these things do, not through argument reaching a conclusion, but through one of you deciding that the conclusion is less important than the ending of the argument, and the ending arrives in the particular silence that follows small domestic conflicts when both people have decided simultaneously to stop. The village outside your window is doing its evening things, conversations between neighbours in the narrow streets, the smell of cooking from several directions simultaneously, each household managing its own variation on the available ingredients, the reversion offerings from the week's temple allocations supplemented by whatever the community's own resources have produced. Someone is singing, somewhere, not performatively, but in the way that people sing when they are occupied with work and the song is simply present in them. A child is complaining about something with the comprehensive commitment to the injustice of the situation that children bring to their complaints, and an adult is responding with the calibrated patience of someone who has heard this particular complaint before. The village, at this hour, is as ordinary as any settlement of working people anywhere in the world. Its extraordinary qualities, the fact that it sits above a valley full of royal tombs, the fact that its inhabitants carry knowledge that almost no one else in Egypt possesses, the fact that their names and their disputes and their grain deliveries are being recorded in documents that will survive 3,500 years in the dry rock. None of this is visible in the ordinary evening sounds of people finishing their days and settling into their nights. The extraordinary and the ordinary occupy the same space, as they always do, as they always have. You sleep in your small house in the place of truth, with the ridge of limestone above you and the Valley of the Kings on the other side of it, and outside your window the dark sky over the West Bank is full of stars that the Egyptians have been watching and naming and incorporating into their theological understanding of the cosmos for longer than any living memory extends. Stars that your community watches partly for their practical agricultural significance, and partly because living on the edge of the place where the dead are kept makes you more attentive than most to the question of what happens after. You sleep in your small house in the place of truth, with the ridge of limestone above you and the Valley of the Kings on the other side of it, and outside your window the dark sky over the West Bank is full of stars that the Egyptians have been watching and naming and incorporating into their theological understanding of the cosmos for longer than any living memory extends, stars that your community watches partly for their practical agricultural significance, and partly because living on the edge of the place where the dead are kept makes you more attentive than most to the question of what happens after. But before the sleeping, there is the evening, and the evening in Deir el-Medina is its own world. The village in the evening hours, after the workers have returned from the valley and the women have concluded the main business of the household day, is a community that comes into a different quality of social existence than it has during the working hours. People sit in doorways, conversations move between houses in the way that they do when everyone knows everyone, and the territory is small enough that privacy and community are in constant negotiation with each other. The children who have been supervised by grandparents or older siblings during the working day are visible again as a collective presence, their games conducted in the narrow streets between the house rows with the comprehensive attention that children give to their own affairs. The community is small. At its height it contains somewhere between 60 and 100 households, a figure that sounds modest but that represents a density of shared knowledge, shared history, and shared daily experience that most communities of that size do not achieve, because most communities of that size are not also professional communities where almost everyone is engaged in the same specialised work and living in circumstances provided by the same employer. The workers of Deir el-Medina knew everything about each other. They knew who was sleeping with whose wife. They knew who had borrowed grain and not paid it back. They knew whose son was showing genuine aptitude for the cutting work and whose son was showing the kind of aptitude that was going to require a difficult conversation. They knew who had been absent from work yesterday and what the stated reason was and whether the stated reason matched the observable reality. This density of knowledge created a social environment that was by turns deeply supportive and thoroughly suffocating, depending on the moment and the relationship. The legal archive from Deir el-Medina includes dozens of cases between neighbours, over property lines, over shared resources, over statements made in public that were interpreted as defamatory. It also includes evidence of people lending each other grain when the deliveries were late, of people caring for each other during illness, of community responses to the deaths of members that involved collective mourning and collective practical support. The same small community that generated an impressive amount of documented litigation was also the community in which people's daily lives were practically supported by their neighbours' willingness to help. The artisan tradition was the backbone of the community's identity, and the transmission of skill across generations was one of the central facts of community life. Sons followed fathers into the cutting teams. Skills were passed down through a combination of formal apprenticeship and informal daily observation, the kind of learning that happens when you grow up watching skilled people work and then begin working alongside them. The quality of the artisanship at Deir el-Medina was high, not uniform in the way that standardized production would be uniform, but consistently skilled in the way that a tradition of genuine craft knowledge produces when it has been passed down carefully. The tomb workers were not simply labourers following instructions. They were artisans who understood their craft well enough to exercise judgment within it, to make the decisions that the work required when the rock behaved unexpectedly, or when the design needed to be adapted to a practical constraint that the original plan had not anticipated. The community's relationship with writing was unusual by the standards of its time. Egypt was a literate society in the sense that writing was a ubiquitous feature of its public life, covering everything from tomb walls to administrative documents to the small ceramic tags attached to jars of preserved goods. But the ability to write was not universally distributed, and the rate of literacy in the general population was limited to those who had received formal scribal training, or who had absorbed basic literacy through their professional activities. The workers of Deir el-Medina had unusually high rates of practical literacy for their social position, and the evidence for this is the simple fact that they wrote so much. Ostraca, the limestone flakes and pottery shards that served as the notepaper of the ancient Egyptian world, were used by this community to record everything from official work notes to personal letters to literary compositions to informal jottings, whose purpose is not always clear 3,000 years later. You know how to write, at the basic level that your work requires. You can record the items in a delivery and confirm their receipt. You can address a note to a colleague. You can write a brief letter, and the letters that the workers of this community wrote to each other and to family members and friends elsewhere in Egypt are among the most human documents that ancient Egypt produced. They ask after people's health. They report on family news. They request specific items to be sent. They express the ordinary concerns of ordinary people living their lives in a specific place and time, and they do so with a directness and specificity that the formal literary tradition of ancient Egypt does not always achieve, because the formal literary tradition was shaped by conventions that valued rhetorical elaboration, while the personal letters were shaped by the practical need to communicate specific information to a specific person in the most efficient way available. Your name is in the administrative records. It has been in them since your father recorded you as an apprentice in the team, and it has been in them since the foreman began including you in the work rosters, and it will be in them for as long as you work here, and then in the records of whatever arrangements are made regarding your household after you're gone. Future administrators and future generations of workers will look at those records and find your name among the others, one entry in a long list that extends back before you and will extend forward after you. 3,500 years from now, in a future that you cannot conceive of, people will read those records and find your name there, and the finding will matter to them in ways that you cannot anticipate, but that you are, in some sense, already contributing to simply by showing up at the valley before sunrise every morning. That is a strange thought, and you do not think it exactly, because the 3,500 years are not available to you as a concept, and the people who will read your name are not available to you as a reality. But the stone is real, and the work is real, and the record being kept is real, and there is something in the regularity of this, the daily fact of names and quantities and absences being noted and stored in the dry limestone rock, that participates in the same impulse that drives the pharaohs to build temples and inscribe their names in the most permanent material available. The impulse toward continuity, the desire to leave a trace, to say, in whatever language and whatever medium is available, that you were here and that what you did was real. Your name. To understand what was actually happening inside an Egyptian temple, you have to start with the official version, because the official version is important. Not as a lie, but as an aspiration, as the publicly stated purpose of an institution that was also doing several other things simultaneously, and the gap between the aspiration and the other things is one of the more instructive gaps available to anyone interested in how institutions work across time. The official story was elegant and complete. The temple was the house of the god, built and maintained for the god's use, administered by trained specialists whose sole purpose was the proper maintenance of the divine relationship. The priests who served there were pure in the ritual sense, trained in the necessary knowledge, appointed to their roles by the divine authority that flowed from Pharaoh. The temple's activities were entirely sacred, directed entirely toward the preservation of Mea, the cosmic order that kept the Nile flooding and the crops growing, and the Egyptian world functioning as it was supposed to. Money had nothing to do with it. Politics had nothing to do with it. Personal ambition, institutional corruption, and the ordinary tendencies of human beings operating within powerful organizations had nothing to do with it. The temple was above those things. This was carved on walls. It was announced at festivals. It was implied by every image and every inscription that the institution produced about itself. And it was believed, genuinely and without irony, by many of the people who participated in it, and many of the people who observed it from the outside. The belief was real, and the institution that the belief described was real, and neither of these things prevents the institution from also having been something considerably more complicated, more human, and more recognizable from the perspective of anyone who has spent time paying attention to how powerful institutions behave when left to manage themselves. The first structural reality to understand is that the Egyptian priesthood was not, for most of its history, a full-time profession for most of the people who held priestly titles. The temple's workforce was organized on a rotation system, divided into groups called philes, of which there were typically 4 in the older periods and sometimes more in later ones. Each phyle served at the temple for approximately 1 month out of every 4, rotating through the year in a pattern that was tracked and administered by the temple's own scribes. The months of non-service were spent outside the temple entirely, in whatever occupations and activities constituted a person's ordinary life. A man could be, simultaneously and without contradiction, a farmer who cultivated a plot of land on the agricultural estate of a provincial town, a soldier in the reserve forces of the local garrison, a craftsman practicing a specialty that had been in his family for generations, and a wab priest of the Temple of Amun at Karnak, entitled to his share of the temple's monthly distributions and required to appear in full ritual readiness when his phile's rotation came around. This meant that the boundary between the sacred world of the temple and the ordinary world of Egyptian society was much more permeable than the official image of the temple as a sealed, sacred enclosure suggested. The priestly workforce carried the ordinary world with them into the temple during their service months, and they carried the temple's world, its knowledge, its resources, its social claims, out into ordinary society during their months away. The knowledge that the temple held, the ritual formulae and the astronomical records and the medical texts and the administrative expertise, did not stay behind the temple walls. It travelled with the priests who had learned it, into the villages and estates and towns where they spent the rest of their lives. Priestly titles were heritable. This is one of the most important structural features of the Egyptian priestly system, and one of the most directly productive of the institutional complications that developed over time. A priestly title passed from father to son in the same way that a craftsman's workshop or a farmer's plot of land could pass as a piece of family property to be managed and preserved across generations. It carried with it not just the social prestige of the title itself, but the economic value attached to it, the share of the temple's revenues and distributions that the holder of the title was entitled to receive during service periods. More significantly still, priestly titles could be bought and sold. They could be divided among heirs in the same way that other property was divided, with the result that over time, a single priestly position could come to be owned in fractions by several different people who rotated their service within the share they held. They could be pledged as security for loans. They could be donated to temples as acts of religious generosity. By the later periods of Egyptian history, The ownership of priestly offices had become a form of institutionalized investment, a way of generating regular income from a religious institution that was legally required to distribute its revenues to its registered title holders. This commodification of priestly access had consequences for the quality of religious service that the institution received, because a share of a priestly title purchased for its income potential and passed to a son who was similarly uninterested in the theological content of the role it nominally represented was a share that would be served by someone whose commitment to the purification requirements and ritual precision of temple service was, at best, variable. The temple's economic base was enormous and growing throughout the New Kingdom. Understanding the scale is important, because the scale is what made the institutional dynamics possible. The major temples of Egypt were not simply religious buildings. They were, in the fullest sense, economic institutions that happened to have a religious identity as their public face. The Temple of... If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The Temple of Amun at Karnak, the largest and most powerful temple in Egypt for most of the New Kingdom, owned agricultural estates whose extent was measured in the tens of thousands of arura, an Egyptian land measure roughly equivalent to about 2/3 of an acre, across multiple regions of the Nile Valley. It owned cattle herds in the thousands, maintained on those estates by dependent farmers who owed labour and service to the temple. It held fishing rights on stretches of the Nile. It operated quarries and mines through royal grants. It administered a workforce of dependent craftsmen, farmers, herders and service workers, whose number, at the institution's height in the reign of Rameses III, was documented in the administrative annals as constituting a significant fraction of the total Egyptian population. The High Priest of Amun, by the later New Kingdom, was not operating as a religious specialist in any limited sense of that term. He was the chief executive of one of the largest economic enterprises in the ancient Near East, responsible for the management of estates and workshops and warehouses and supply chains and administrative personnel across a territory that extended well beyond the temple's immediate precinct. His relationship to the pharaoh was nominally one of subordination, the high priest serving at pharaoh's pleasure and exercising his authority as a delegate of royal power. In practice, by the later periods, the office had become so deeply embedded in the institutional structures of powerful priestly families that removing a high priest of Amun from the office required a level of political will and practical maneuvering that most pharaohs found not worth the cost. The most dramatic illustration of where this dynamic could lead is the Third Intermediate Period, the centuries after the end of the New Kingdom, in which Egypt ceased to be a unified state and divided into effectively independent regions. In this period, the high priests of Amun at Thebes became the effective rulers of Upper Egypt, governing their territory in their own names while acknowledging the nominal authority of pharaohs who were operating from a different part of the country and who lacked the practical power to insist on more than nominal deference. The priests became kings as directly as the institutional logic of the situation allowed, and they documented their authority in the pharaonic style, with cartouches and royal epithets and monumental inscriptions, adjusting the formula only enough to preserve the theological fiction that ultimate authority still resided with the pharaonic office, while communicating to anyone paying attention that the practical situation was different. This is where the trajectory of an institution founded on sacred claims and maintained through accumulating wealth leads, when operated across a sufficiently long time span without adequate structural accountability. The priests were not uniquely corrupt or uniquely ambitious. They were operating within a system that rewarded certain behaviours and did not adequately penalise others, and the results were the results that such systems reliably produce. The corruption that appeared at lower levels of the institutional hierarchy was not dramatic in the way that the political ambitions of the high priests were dramatic. It was the quieter, more familiar corruption of people in positions of material responsibility who found that small diversions were easy and the mechanisms for detecting them were limited. Grain that was supposed to reach the workers at Deir el-Medina did not arrive. Goods in the temple storehouses found their way into the personal storage of the administrators responsible for them. Land belonging to the temple estate was quietly incorporated into adjacent private holdings. Priestly offices were allocated to individuals whose qualifications for them were primarily financial rather than theological. Records were kept with a selective accuracy that preserved the appearances of correct procedure while quietly accommodating the realities of diverted goods. The workers at Deir el-Medina documented the consequences of this from the bottom up. The papyri from this community include multiple records of work stoppages, occasions on which the workers left the Valley of the Kings and appeared at the administrative centres of the mortuary temples demanding the rations that were overdue. The earliest of these recorded stoppages dates to the reign of Rameses III, a reign that the Harris Papyrus presents as a pinnacle of royal piety and temple generosity, a reign during which the temples received enormous quantities of donated wealth. The disconnect between that official picture and the simultaneous failure to deliver grain to the workers whose labour maintained the royal tombs is not a contradiction in the record. It is a feature of the record. The wealth that flowed into the temples did not reliably flow out again to the workers who depended on it, because somewhere in the chain of management and distribution, it was being handled by people whose relationship to the stated institutional purpose was primarily administrative rather than genuinely committed to that purpose's fulfillment. The priestly knowledge system provided a further layer of institutional protection and complexity. The temples maintained libraries, the institutions called houses of life, that held accumulated knowledge of substantial range and practical importance. Astronomical records dating back centuries, observations of celestial patterns that informed the agricultural calendar and the orientation of religious festivals. Medical texts of varying quality but genuine empirical foundation, some of which documented treatments for specific conditions with the kind of detailed observation that suggests actual clinical practice rather than purely theoretical prescription. Mathematical and engineering texts that supported the ambitious construction programs the temples organised and administered. Literary texts, historical records, religious compositions that constituted the intellectual heritage of a civilization 3,000 years in the making. There were also, and this needs to be said clearly and held alongside everything else, priests who were exactly what the institution claimed to be producing. Men who entered priestly service with genuine religious motivation, who performed their duties with precision and care, who experienced the ritual cycle of the temple as a meaningful engagement with something real rather than a professional obligation. The communities of scholars who maintained the houses of life included people of genuine intellectual curiosity and rigour, who pushed the astronomical and medical and mathematical knowledge of the culture forward through actual observation and analysis rather than simple preservation of tradition. The craftsmen who produced the temple reliefs and statuary were artists of exceptional skill, working within a visual tradition of extraordinary sophistication, producing objects whose quality reflected genuine dedication to their craft rather than merely adequate execution of a specification. The physicians who worked from the medical knowledge preserved in temple libraries produced treatments that were effective for some conditions, and that documented their observations in ways that constituted a real, if limited, contribution to the development of medical practice. The reality of the Egyptian temple system, held together clearly, is neither a simple endorsement of the official picture nor a simple debunking of it. It was an institution that was simultaneously genuinely extraordinary in its achievements and recognisably ordinary in its failures. It produced magnificent art. It preserved important knowledge. It provided a framework of meaning and community for a society that had organised itself around its rhythms for millennia. And it accumulated wealth in ways that corrupted individuals, protected institutional failures from scrutiny, allowed political ambitions to dress themselves in sacred language, and produced a gap between its stated purpose and its operational reality that was managed primarily through the production of images and texts that described the stated purpose while the reality went undiscussed. The festivals were when the gap was narrowest. On the major feast days, when the cult statue was carried out of its sanctuary in a portable shrine and borne through the city streets in a procession attended by thousands of ordinary Egyptians who had gathered to witness it, when the music played and the incense burned in the open air, and the sight of the sacred image moving among the people created something that no administrative failure could entirely undermine. The institution functioned exactly as it claimed to. People experienced it as a real encounter with the divine. The meaning was present, felt in the body, not requiring theological argumentation to access. The accumulated centuries of the tradition carried weight that was experienced as weight, as the physical sensation of something ancient and still potent. That was real. Whatever was happening simultaneously in the storehouses and the administrative offices, what happened in the streets during the great processions was also real. The festivals were when the gap was narrowest. On the major feast days, when the cult statue was carried out of its sanctuary in a portable shrine and borne through the city streets in a procession attended by thousands of ordinary Egyptians who had gathered to witness it, when the music played and the incense burned in the open air, and the sight of the sacred image moving among the people created something that no administrative failure could entirely undermine, the institution functioned exactly as it claimed to. People experienced it as a real encounter with the divine. The meaning was present, felt in the body, not requiring theological argumentation to access. The accumulated centuries of the tradition carried weight that was experienced as weight, as the physical sensation of something ancient and still potent. That was real. Whatever was happening simultaneously in the storehouses and the administrative offices, what happened in the streets during the great processions was also real. The oracular tradition of the Egyptian temples added another dimension to the institution's public function that deserves its own consideration. The cult statue, when it was processed in its portable shrine on the shoulders of its priestly bearers, could be consulted on questions. People lined the processional route with petitions, with questions written on ostraca, with names of suspects in unresolved disputes, and the movement of the bark, the ways in which it seemed to press forward or pull back when carried by the priests, was interpreted as divine response. Whether you inclined toward the position that the movement was genuinely divine guidance, or toward the position that it was the result of the priests adjusting their grip in response to subtle social cues was, in ancient Egypt, not a question most people spent much time on. The oracle functioned. Disputes were resolved by its authority. Social tensions that would otherwise have required a human arbiter to adjudicate were resolved through a process that both parties had agreed in advance to accept as legitimate. The practical social function of this was real regardless of the theological question, and the temple that provided it was providing something of genuine value to its community. There were also the Akhenaten episode, the brief and apparently sincere attempt by a pharaoh of the 18th dynasty to reorganize Egyptian religion around a single solar deity and dismantle the priestly hierarchy that had accumulated such power, is worth considering in this context not as a theological experiment, but as an institutional conflict. Akhenaten, whose personal name was originally Amenhotep IV, closed the traditional temples, redirected their revenues, moved the capital to a new city built from scratch in the desert, at a site now called Amarna, and attempted to create a new religious order centered entirely on the Aten, the visible solar disk, with himself as the sole intermediary between the Aten and humanity. This eliminated the priestly hierarchy at a stroke, concentrating all religious authority in the pharaoh's own person. The reasons for this radical program are debated and probably multiple. Personal religious conviction, genuine theological innovation, the political desire to break the power of the Amun priesthood, whose economic base had become a genuine challenge to pharaonic authority, all of these may have played roles. What is clear is that the attempt failed. The temples were restored, the traditional religious order was reinstated, the capital was abandoned, and within a generation of Akhenaten's death, the institution he had tried to suppress was back in operation, and his own memory was being systematically erased in the same way that Hatshepsut's would be, in the generation after hers. The institutional resilience of the temple system, its capacity to absorb a direct challenge from the pharaoh himself and return to its previous form within a generation, is one of the more striking demonstrations of how thoroughly it was embedded in the economic and social fabric of Egyptian life. Human institutions exist in this way, holding their aspirations and their failures together in the same body, continuing to produce genuine meaning and genuine dysfunction simultaneously, managing the gap between what they say they are and what they actually are through the production of images and narratives and ceremonies that emphasize the aspiration while keeping the dysfunction internal. The Egyptian temple was not unique in this. It was in fact extraordinarily typical, which is part of what makes it so interesting to study at 3,500 years of distance. The distance is large enough that we can see the whole shape of it, the entire arc from the Middle Kingdom temples to the Greco-Roman period when Egyptian temples were still being built and the old ritual forms were still being performed in a language that was by then a specialist religious tongue rather than a living vernacular. 3,000 years of continuous institutional operation documented in both its official and unofficial dimensions, long enough to see every pattern, long enough to see an institution that was, simultaneously, one of the most creative and preserving forces in the ancient world, and one of the most consistently human organizations in the way that human organizations tend to behave when left to manage themselves for long enough. The last Egyptian temples went dark over a long and uneven period, not in a single moment of closure but in a gradual retreat as the Christian Roman Empire's policies made their continued operation increasingly difficult and eventually impossible. The temple at Philae, dedicated to Isis and located on an island at the first cataract of the Nile, is often cited as the last place where the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic script was written in a datable inscription, an event that occurred in the late 4th century of the Common Era. A religious and scribal tradition that had been continuous for over 3,000 years at that point ended not with a dramatic collapse, but with the quiet stopping of a practice that no one was left to continue. The process of losing the ability to read the hieroglyphic script is one of the strangest silences in the history of human knowledge. The script had been in continuous use for approximately 3,500 years, maintained by the priestly and scribal traditions of the temples, taught from generation to generation through the educational apparatus of the houses of life. When those institutions stopped functioning, the transmission of the knowledge stopped with them, and within a few generations the script was no longer readable by anyone living. The images on the temple walls continued to speak their accumulated theological arguments to anyone who walked beneath them, but the argument had become unreadable. The words were still present, the readers were gone. For approximately 1400 years the script sat in its silence. Travellers and scholars observed the images and the text with curiosity, and occasionally with confident but incorrect interpretations that assigned meanings to symbols based on creative speculation rather than actual knowledge. The idea that the hieroglyphs were a secret mystical script encoding hidden philosophical wisdom, popular among European scholars of the Renaissance and early modern periods, was a reasonable guess given what those scholars had available to work with, and it was wrong in essentially every particular. The script was not mystical. It was a complex but decipherable writing system that encoded a spoken language, and the path to deciphering it was the Rosetta Stone, the trilingual inscription found during Napoleon's Egyptian campaign that provided the same text in Greek, Demotic Egyptian, and hieroglyphs, and that allowed Thomas Young and then Jean-François Champollion to work out the system in the early 19th century. The decipherment of the hieroglyphic script is one of the great intellectual achievements of the modern era, and it gave back to the historical record an enormous quantity of material that had been present but unreadable for 14 centuries. Everything that the Egyptians had written in their temples and their tombs and their administrative documents became available again. The biographical inscriptions, the medical papyri, the love poetry, the legal records from Deir el-Medina, the annals of Thutmose III's campaigns, the erased cartouches of Hatshepsut that could now be identified as erasures rather than simply defaced surfaces. The silence ended. The argument resumed. This is the specific quality of the Egyptian record that is unlike almost any other ancient civilization's legacy. It is not simply that the artifacts survived, though the artifacts survived in extraordinary numbers and conditions. It is that the text survived alongside the artifacts, and that text is now readable, and the reading of it has been a continuous project for 200 years that has produced an increasingly detailed and increasingly human picture of what Egyptian civilization was like from the inside. Not just what it looked like from the outside, not just the monuments and the art and the general shape of the political history, but what it felt like to live in it, work in it, argue about grain deliveries within it, hold religious offices within it, have your name erased from it and then come back anyway. The gods themselves did not vanish. They were absorbed, adapted, transformed. Isis became one of the most widely worshipped deities in the Roman Empire. Horus merged with various Roman solar figures. The images and the theological concepts travelled, changed, influenced, and contributed to the religious traditions that replaced them. Nothing of that scale and that age disappears entirely. It dissolves into what comes after it, and you can trace the outlines of the dissolution if you look carefully at what came after. The stone is still there, the reliefs are still there, the hypostyle halls of Karnak and the terraces of Deir el-Bahari and the dim corridors of 100 smaller temples scattered along the Nile are still there in degrees of survival, ranging from substantial to fragmentary. The administrative records from Deir el-Medina are still there, in collections around the world, their contents available to anyone with the training to read them. The medical papyri are still there. The astronomical records are still there. The love poetry is still there. The legal disputes about donkeys are still there. And the gap between the official image and the daily reality is still there too, preserved in the same archive that preserves everything else, because the Egyptians were thorough documentarians of their own lives, and they documented the dysfunction alongside the aspiration with the same care. Which is perhaps the most valuable thing they left behind, not the temples and not the tombs and not the art, though all of these are extraordinary, but the simple fact of the documentation. The record of people trying to manage large institutions across long periods of time, making the same kinds of mistakes that large institutions make, producing the same kinds of beauty and corruption and genuine devotion and self-interested manipulation that large institutions produce, writing it all down on whatever surface was available and leaving it for whoever came after to find. We are the whoever who came after. The night is late. The stone is patient. And now the night is late, and the lamp oil is running low, and the stone of the West Bank is cool and dark outside the window, and the valley is sealed and silent above the ridge, and all the stories that have been told tonight settle into the quiet that follows them. You stood in the corridor with your lamp and felt the accumulated weight of 1,000 years of daily ritual in the stone around you. Felt it in your body rather than your mind, in the quieting that the space produced without asking your permission. You followed Hatshepsut from the court of her father through the regency and the assumption of the double crown, through 22 years of building and trading and inscribing her name into stone with the careful attention of someone who understood the relationship between monuments and memory, through the erasure that came after her death, and the long silence that followed, and the eventual, oblique, dental evidence-assisted return to the historical record 3,500 years later. You walked the path over the ridge before sunrise with the workers of Setmat, descended into the cut with your copper chisel and your oil lamp, listened to the sound of the chisel in the rock echoing in the sealed corridor, ate your bread at midday in the furnace of the valley, went home over the ridge in the evening to find the grain still late and the tribunal still pending, and the neighbours grinding stone still unaddressed. You looked behind the temple walls at the institution that was producing the incense and the reliefs, and the sacred silence, and also the embezzlement and the late deliveries and the priests who had purchased their offices as income-producing investments, and the high priests who had become effectively independent rulers, and the administrative apparatus that was managing the gap between all of these things simultaneously. What connects these four accounts is not simply that they all happened in Egypt. What connects them is the relationship between the image and the reality, between the way things were officially described and the way they were actually lived by the people inside them. The temple presented a face of cosmic order and sacred purity, and behind that face was an organization of people doing physical work in the heat, people with headaches from the incense and aching feet from the stone floors and ongoing negotiations with themselves about whether they were doing their natron rinse correctly or just performing the doing of it correctly. The pharaoh was defined as a male divine office, and a woman held it for 22 years with considerable success, and then had her name removed from the walls, and survived the removal in the stone itself because stone is stubborn in the ways that matter. The community of tomb workers was defined by their trusted relationship to the sacred secrets they guarded, and most of them maintained that relationship faithfully, and some of them, when the official system failed badly enough that the arrangement of incentives no longer held, did not. The priesthood claimed to stand entirely outside the ordinary human concerns of wealth and politics and ambition, and it produced some of the finest artistic and scholarly achievements of the ancient world, and also produced high priests who became kings and administrators, who embezzled grain, and families who treated sacred offices as heritable investments. In every era and in every institution, people find themselves inside the gap between what the institution claims to be and what it is, and they navigate that gap as best they can with the tools and the circumstances available to them. They carry water through incense-heavy corridors before sunrise. They cut rock in the heat and talk about the grain delivery while they do it. They keep records of their arguments with their neighbours on broken pottery, because the papyrus is too expensive and the argument is too immediate. They send trading ships to the edge of the known world and then spend considerable effort ensuring that the record of having done so is preserved in the most permanent medium available, because they understood something about permanence that is still operative 3,500 years later. They wanted to be remembered. They wanted the record of what they had done and who they had been to outlast the span of a single human life. The pharaohs wanted it most explicitly, in the largest and most visible form, but the workers who put their names in the administrative records wanted it too, in the smaller and more ordinary form. And the amazing thing, the thing that makes this particular civilization worth the attention that 3,500 years of human curiosity is devoted to it, is that it worked. The record survived, the stone survived, the broken pottery survived, the teeth survived. The stone is patient in a way that human ambition is not, and the patience of the stone is what made the ambition's record available. The stars above the West Bank are the same stars the Egyptians named and watched and incorporated into the most permanent record they knew how to make, the same stars that the astronomer priests observed from temple rooftops and recorded in their long astronomical logs, and that the workers at Deir el-Medina saw from their village above the valley. The valley is sealed and dark tonight, as it has been sealed and dark for most of 3,000 years, and what is inside it has been there for a very long time, and has survived things that the people who built it could not have anticipated, including the systematic erasure programs of ambitious dynasties and the depredations of ancient and modern tomb robbers, and the well-intentioned but occasionally damaging attentions of the scholars who came to understand it. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The connection between then and now is not only in the museums where the objects are and the academic journals where the arguments continue. It is in the simple fact that institutions still behave the way the Egyptian temple behaved, accumulating wealth and power in excess of their stated purposes, producing genuine and important work alongside the institutional failures, managing the gap between image and reality through the production of official representations that emphasize the aspiration. It is in the fact that people in positions of physical and institutional labour still find themselves as replaceable components in systems that were not designed for their comfort, and still find meaning in that labour anyway, and still argue about late deliveries and neighbours' broken grinding stones. It is in the fact that someone who was determined to be remembered found a way to leave enough of a record that a tooth in a box could bring her name back 3,500 years later. It is also in the quality of this particular hour, the late night, the quieting of the ordinary world, the particular receptiveness that comes with the approach of sleep. The Egyptians believed that the hours between midnight and dawn were the hours when the sun god made his passage through the underworld, navigating the dangers of the deep dark before emerging renewed at sunrise. The night was not empty to them. It was full, actively full, of the divine machinery that produced the morning. They lay in the dark the same way you're lying in it now, under the same stars, with the same morning coming, and the knowledge of that continuity is part of what tonight's stories have been carrying. That is worth lying still with for a moment. The distance between then and now is very long, and also at this hour very short. The lamp is low, the incense has settled. The valley above the ridge is doing what valleys do in the long dark, which is to hold what it has been given with a patience that has no comparison in the human world. Let that settle into the dark with you now. The work was real. The names are in the stone. The night is long and quiet, and the morning is far enough away that it does not need to be thought about yet. Sleep well. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.